Yes, sir. Not yet. Give me another week, and I might have more to add to what we just discussed. All right, here we go. I have a question for y'all. Have you ever been in a situation where you knew what the outcome was going to be before it ever happened, and it was going to be poor? I'm sure most of us have, right? And so now I'm going to tell one on my youngest son. I remember the first time I let Robert get on a motorbike. I've got two little 47cc motorcycles that I bought from my last boss. And, they're fun to zip around on. And we stay in the yard on the grass. And I make him wear a helmet, long sleeves and all that. But the first time I ever let Robert ride on one, I told him, son, at some point, you're going to get headed a direction that you don't want to go and start getting nervous. And your reaction is going to be to hold on to them handlebars tighter, and you're going to goose the throttle and speed up how fast you're going toward that object. And he said, oh, no, not me, Dad. I'll push the handlebars away from me and let go of the throttle. I said, okay, when you start heading towards something you don't want to run into, pull the clutch, disengage the engine from the transmission. Okay, Dad. He got that thing in gear and lit off, headed straight for an oak tree this big around. I mean, just dead toward it. And what'd he do? Wah! Goose the throttle. And I'm screaming, pull the clutch, pull the clutch, pull the clutch. Before it ever started, Liz went back in our bedroom because she said, I can't watch this. And then she heard me frantically shouting, pull the clutch, and came running out the house just in time to see Robert miss that oak tree by about that much. He turned the handlebars just in time and got halfway through the backyard and then pulled the clutch and turned around like everything was fine. Man, you talk about an experience. Thank you. I have a story to tell for life. That has nothing to do with what we're studying tonight. But like I said, I struggle with introductions, and I need a story that'll at least get y'all engaged and laughing. So, other than that, I knew what might happen, and it might be bad before it started. That's the only relation. So tonight, we're going to look at all of chapter 8 in Esther. And we'll look at what the rulers of the Persian Empire will try to do to avert the crisis that Haman's created by writing this law to eradicate the Jews. Okay? So let's read our scriptures and we'll dive into it. Esther chapter 8. On that day, King Xerxes gave the house of Haman, the adversary of the Jews, to Queen Esther, and Mordecai came before the king. For Esther had told what he was to her. And the king removed his signet ring, which he had taken away from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. And Esther set Mordecai over the house of Haman. Then Esther spoke again to the king, fell at his feet, wept, and implored him to repeal the evil scheme of Haman the Agagite, and his scheme which he had devised against the Jews. And the king extended the golden scepter to Esther, so Esther arose and stood before the king. Then she said, if it seems good to the king, if I found favor before him, and the matter seems proper to the king, and I am good in his eyes, let it be written to turn back the letters devised by Haman the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, which he wrote to cause the Jews who are in all the king's provinces to perish. For how can I endure to see the calamity which will befall my people, and how can I endure to see the perishing of my kinsmen? So King Xerxes said to Queen Esther and to Mordecai the Jew, behold, I've given the house of Haman to Esther, and him they have hanged on the gallows because he had sent forth his hand against the Jews. Now you write to the Jews according to what is good in your eyes in the king's name, and seal it with the king's signet ring, for a written decree which is written in the name of the king and sealed with the king's signet ring may not be turned back. So the king's scribes were called at that time in the 3rd month, that is the month Sivan, on the 23rd day, and it was written according to all that Mordecai commanded to the Jews. The satraps, the governors, and the princes of the provinces, which extended from India to Ethiopia, 127 provinces, to every province according to its script, and to every people according to their tongue, as well as to the Jews according to their script and their tongue. And he wrote in the name of King Xerxes, and sealed it with the king's signet ring, and sent letters by the hand of couriers on horses, riding on steeds sired by the royal stud. In them the king gave the Jews who were in each and every city the right to assemble and to make a stand for their lives, to destroy, to kill, and to cause to perish the entire military force of any people or province which would act as their adversaries, including little ones and women, and to plunder their spoil. On one day in all the provinces of King Xerxes, the 13th day of the 12th month, that is the month Adar, a copy of that which was written down to be given as law in each and every province was revealed to all the people, so the Jews would be ready for this day to avenge themselves on their enemies. The couriers hurried and hastened by the king's word, went out, riding on royal steeds, and the law was given out at the citadel in Susa. Then Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in royal robes of blue and fine white linen, with a large crown of gold and a garment of fine linen and purple. And the city of Susa cried aloud and was glad. For the Jews there was light and gladness and joy and honor. And in each and every province and in each and every city, wherever the king's word and his law reached, there was gladness and joy for the Jews, a feast and a holiday. And many among the peoples of the land became Jews, for the dread of the Jews had fallen on them. All right, verses 1 and 2. Following the hanging of Haman, Xerxes assigns management of Haman's household, his belongings, his family, basically his entire estate is assigned to Esther. Haman would have had a great deal of wealth to be managed, and Xerxes provides all this wealth to Esther. This further elevates Esther within the kingdom and the local culture there. For her to be given such a vast amount of wealth all at once would provide her with a great deal more influence than she once had. Before, she was just a poor girl who happened to be the queen. Now, not only is she the queen, but she's also quite wealthy. Probably more wealthy than a lot of the princes in the area. Also, Mordecai is called before the king, and at this point, Esther's finally revealed to Xerxes not only what her heritage is, but also that Mordecai was in fact her cousin. Right? This is the first time in the story that Esther tells Xerxes directly that she's a Jew and Mordecai's her cousin. I don't know that it's a particularly important moment, but it provides Xerxes with some of the background information, and it's also kind of timely. If you think about the timeline, I know it's been 3 weeks of covering this same day, but this is the day after Xerxes' sleepless night, right? Xerxes had his sleepless night, and then he had Mordecai exalted, and then they had the second feast of Esther. Haman was hanged, and now we're still on the same day, right? Verse 8, or chapter 8, verse 1 starts with, on that day. So we're still on the same day. So it's the same day that Xerxes had Mordecai paraded around town, and therefore Xerxes was already predisposed to like Mordecai because it was fresh in his mind what Mordecai had done for him. And now this plot against the Jews has been revealed, and it's like, well, bring him on in. So Xerxes takes off his signet ring that would be used to seal royal decrees that he had taken back from Haman, probably just before they carried him off to the gallows. And he gives it to Mordecai. And finally, Esther puts Mordecai over the house of Haman. And that makes sense to me, right? Esther's living in the king's palace. She's the queen. She's presumably the king's favorite wife at this point. She's well off. She doesn't really need all of Haman's wealth. She just gives it to her cousin, who had adopted her when she was orphaned. And in addition to that, Mordecai could said to be responsible for the events that have occurred up to this point. Mordecai is the one that put Esther in the running to be the queen. Mordecai is the one that advised Esther to go to Xerxes. Mordecai is the one that gave Esther the courage to face death in defense of her people. He has been instrumental to the outcome so far, and as such, his loving cousin now gives him the wealth of his enemy. All right, verses 3 through 6, Esther does what we discussed before. Now is the time to throw herself at the feet of the king and weep and beg. And she does just that. In tears, she begs him to repeal the evil law that Haman had written that would see all her people destroyed. So in verse 4, it says that again, Xerxes extended the golden scepter to Esther. And I'm not sure whether like formal court had restarted and she was approaching the throne again later in the day, or if he's simply just trying to show her, it's okay, sweetheart. I understand. You know what I mean? The extending the golden scepter to her would have been a way of saying, you're permissible here. You can speak freely. If she had come into the court unsummoned, in this context, I'm not entirely sure what's happening. You let your conscience guide you on that. But Xerxes does give her permission to speak freely. So Esther makes her actual request known. This is the one that started all the course of events in action, right? Everything up to this point has been for her to say, free my people from this horrible law. So this time there is a hint of desperation in her voice. She's not the calm and collected Esther that we've seen in the past. She knows that the victory is basically won, but now she's putting everything on the line. She needs the right resolution. And there's only one man in the empire that can do it. And she appeals to him. There's 4 phrases she uses in her appeal to the king in verse 5 that I just want to kind of call out. First, she says, if it seems good to the king. So she's appealing to his judgment as king. She's saying, I want you to evaluate what's happened and what is right and make a determination based on that. Next, she says, if I have found favor before you. So now she appeals to her own performance as the queen. And it's like she's saying to him, do you like me as much as you say you do? And then she says, if the matter seems proper to the king. So she's again appealing to his judgment. And she's asking him, is having an entire people wiped out within your empire a proper way to rule? She appeals to his sensibilities. And finally, she says, if I am good in your eyes. Once again, appealing to his emotions toward her. She's basically playing the wife trump card. If you really love me, you'll do this for me. So Esther is shrewd, even in her panic and desperate plea for help. She appeals to the king's good judgment and then to his affection, and she repeats that pattern one more time to drive it home. She's using every tool in her toolbox to convince Xerxes to put a stop to the madness. So she goes on to say she wouldn't be able to endure watching all her kinsmen be killed. Again, pulling on the heartstrings of the king, right? I don't often promote this or discuss it, ladies, but I can tell you, for a man that truly loves his wife, we can't stand to see y'all cry. It just, right? I'm sure the men in the room can nod along with me. There's like a panic alarm that goes off inside our heads, right? We got to find a way to make the tears stop. It just, I can't explain it. I think it's one of those instincts in a man. I don't endorse using this tactic regularly. It can be abused. But as I've said throughout our study of the book, pay attention when Esther speaks. Pay attention to how Esther frames the conversation. Pay attention to how she approaches issues when she talks to people. There's much wisdom to be gained from Esther. There's much we can learn from her poise, her intelligence, and her tact. And not just the women in the room, the men as well. We can all learn from Esther's example. And I would encourage all of you to go back and reread the whole book of Esther as we're getting ready to close it out, and just take notes every time Esther speaks and how she frames the discussion. This book is part of the Bible because God inspired it, and God inspired it so we can learn from it. And that's one of the best things we can learn from this book, is to observe the good manners and the good posture of some of the main characters. Obviously, God's providence is all through this book, and it's a redemption story. The whole Bible is a redemption story. But there are specifics we can learn from it that we can apply to our lives. All right, in verses 7 and 8, after hearing Esther's plea for relief, Xerxes is going to give his judgment and his commands as to what's to be done. So he tells Mordecai and Esther 2 things. First, he says, look, Haman's been dealt with. We hung him, and Esther's in charge of his house. Done deal. Then he tells them, write to the Jews in my name, seal it with my ring. So it's an unrevocable law. It's permanent. And he says, write whatever is good in your eyes. He gives them blanket permission. Same permission he gave Haman earlier in the book that got us in this predicament. But now in an attempt to write it, he gives them the same blanket permission. It was. And that's why he couldn't revoke it. That's why he didn't just say, okay, fine, it's off the books. He couldn't. As the king of Persia, the rule of the Medes and Persians was once the king stamps it, it's a done deal. That's right. We talked about that. Keep the king honest. So let's see what Esther and Mordecai deemed to be right in their eyes concerning the Jews. In verses 9 through 12, they call the king's scribes on the 23rd day of the 3rd month. So that would leave the Jews roughly 8 months to enact whatever it is Mordecai writes. So the scribes are called in to record the law that Mordecai and Esther will write in the name of the king. So again, this is very similar to what happened when Haman wrote his law concerning the Jews. The law was written, it's sent to the satraps, the governors, the princes, etc., all 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia. And it's also to be written in the language and script of each individual province, right? Just as it was before. This way nobody could claim ignorance. Not only is it in your language, but it's also in the style writing you guys use. So Mordecai writes his law via the scribes in the name of King Xerxes, seals it with Xerxes' signet ring, which officially makes it law. And then he has it sent out across the empire. The copies of the law for the provinces are distributed by the hands of couriers on horseback. Pony Express, 3,600 years before the Pony Express, right? Or not that early. I guess we're talking 470, 460 BC. So anyway, there is an odd detail contained in the middle here, which is interesting. I don't know that it's really applicable or anything, but I just mention it because it's in the text. It says that the couriers rode on steeds sired by the royal stud. So presumably there was one horse in the palace that was superior to all the other horses, and the couriers all rode on children of that horse. I guess to paint the picture that the utmost care and attention was paid to get the word out quickly about the new law. So much so that the royal bloodline of horses was utilized in getting the word out. Like I said, I don't really know what to do with it, but it's there, and you got to address it, right? All right, so let's look at what's actually in the decree, what they actually wrote down, what was good in their eyes. The new law gives the Jews permission to assemble a defense force in each province and defend themselves against any force that would attempt to attack them. Anyone that would attack the Jews were permitted to kill and take their goods as spoils. Look at verse, is it 11? Yeah, look at verse 11 real quick. The last sentence of verse, or the last part of verse 11. Mine says, and to cause to perish the entire military force of any people or province which would act as their adversaries, including little ones and women, and to plunder their spoil. There's some debate here as to what that exactly refers to. If you remember, Haman's initial decree permitted the people of the empire to kill the Jewish women and children as well, because he wanted to wipe out the entire race. So it very well could be that this is just a parroting of that, so to speak. Just replicate Haman's law and change some of the details. Could be. Some read this to say that Mordecai gave that same permission to the Jews. Others read it to say that any Jew who was attacked was permitted to defend themselves, even the women and children. I have never studied Hebrew, but I wanted to chase this down and find out exactly what was being said here. And from what I understand, from all the commentaries and whatnot I read, is that the Hebrew is ambiguous. It could read a number of ways. So we're not entirely certain what's being said here. But let me read to you the NIV translation, and maybe that'll help shed some light on it. Because I think they did a good job of getting the feel for the verse. So in the NIV it reads, "The king's edict granted the Jews in every city the right to assemble and protect themselves, to destroy, kill, and annihilate the armed men of any nationality or province who might attack them and their women and children, and to plunder the property of their enemies." I tend to think that's what was meant here, right? Not so much that Esther and Mordecai are permitting people to attack women and children, but they're permitting the Jewish people to defend themselves. And I base that on the fact that this law is being written by the hand of a righteous man. Right? Mordecai has shown himself to be righteous throughout this book, and I can't see him saying, yeah, kill their women and children too. It just doesn't add up. Right? It doesn't fit his character. It doesn't fit the kind of person he seems to be. If you want to fight back with me on that, by all means, whatever. You can let your conscience be your guide on that one. But I don't say this very often, so I'm glad we got it on camera. I think the NIV did a better job here. So, and all these events are to occur on one day across the entire empire, right? The 13th day of the 12th month, which is the day that Haman had declared based on throwing lots and the diviners, right? It's the day Haman had decided that the Jews were to be wiped out. So obviously this is written specifically to counteract the law that Haman wrote, right? On that day, y'all go ahead and defend yourselves. And now it's just basically you're going to have brawls in the streets of Persia. I don't know if anyone still wants to attack the Jews. You have to come back next week to find out. That's my plug for next Wednesday, by the way. All right, verses 13 and 14, they send the word out across the empire. The couriers are hastened by the king's word. So the king has put urgency on getting the word out, specifically to ensure that on the 12th month, right? Because if you think about how big Persia was, and they're on horseback, it might take a while to get from Susa all the way to Egypt. And so he's like, hurry, 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 get the word out so that the Jews will be warned and informed of the law in enough time to be prepared to defend themselves. And the law is also given out there in Susa at the capital. So in our last three verses, Mordecai leaves the presence of the king, and he's clothed much differently from what he was once clothed in. He's now wearing white and blue and purple with a crown of gold. He's literally been made a prince. This is the Mordecai who refused to bow down to men, but only bowed to God. The Mordecai who donned sackcloth and ashes and mourned the plight of his people. The same Mordecai who cried out to God for relief and believed that God would deliver them. The same Mordecai, our great man of faith and righteousness, has now received his exaltation as a result of his patience and trust in God. I've spent a lot of time in the past telling you guys what a great example Esther is for us, but I haven't said much of Mordecai, and I'd like to now. As you go back and reread the book and take your notes on what Esther has to say, pay attention to how Mordecai acts through it all. He adopted his orphan cousin. He raised her as his own. He took her best interests in mind when he sent her to interview to be queen. He discovered a plot against the king and revealed it to the proper authorities to prevent the murder of a ruler. He's a law-abiding citizen. He refused to bow before men. He encouraged and guided Esther to attempt to save the Jews from their certain demise. And above all things, he never ceased to trust God. Remember his words to Esther, and maybe these should be the most famous words of the book. He says, if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. So all the Jews throughout the empire are glad. They hold a bunch of feasts and special holidays to celebrate that they're going to be allowed to defend themselves and should survive. You can imagine the relief and the elation they felt as now they're allowed to band together and fight back against anyone that might decide to attack them, right? In the previous law, It's just allowed, just go slaughter the Jews. And now they're allowed to fight back. And finally, many of the people of the land became Jews for fear of the Jews. So certainly word had gotten out, as it usually does, that the queen and new prime minister were Jews. And now the Jews are permitted to defend themselves. And I could easily see the people of the empire looking around at the situation and saying, yep, we should become Jews. For two reasons. One, their God is clearly a powerful God. And two, we don't want to be mistaken as a potential enemy on the 13th day of Adar. So maybe not a real heartfelt conversion at first, but probably following. So I've got three things I want you guys to carry home tonight. But first, I want you to observe and think about the major change in circumstances that occurred in a short 24-hour period. Right? Just to summarize it, Haman was second in command of the empire. Now he's dead, hung on the very gallows he constructed for Mordecai. Mordecai, who was just a humble servant in the king's government, has now been exalted to the place of second in the kingdom and is changed from his regular plain-clothes to the clothes of royalty. Esther, who is nothing but a poor orphan, Esther, who is nothing but a poor orphan, is now the queen of the largest empire on earth and has been granted a high amount of favor before the king. These two simple, humble Jews persevered in their service to God and righteousness, and as a result, have been exalted to the highest places of the kingdom. Additionally, the Jewish peoples were slated to be wiped out of existence in one fell swoop, and now have been granted the opportunity to defend themselves and remain. It's a huge swing in the momentum of things in one day's time. I read to you last week how Christ said that the proud would be humbled and the humble would be exalted. That doesn't mean you'll be given wealth and riches for following Jesus well. But it does mean that as long as you're faithful to Him, you never know what He has in store for you. And I want to encourage everyone tonight, and anyone who watches online, to remain steadfast in prayer for this church. If we humble ourselves and seek His will, He will preserve us. All right, second, trust God. There is nothing that God cannot do. He does not have plan B, ever. We need to trust God because He will work things to His will and purpose, and we benefit from it. If you think back to Genesis chapter 50, when after Jacob dies, Joseph's brothers come to him, and they're concerned that now Joseph is going to exact revenge for the way they treated him now that his father's dead. And what does Joseph say to them? What you intended for evil, God intended for good. God can and does use the circumstances of our lives and even the evil intentions of others to work together for His good will and pleasure. There's nothing too big for God. There's nothing that can hinder Him. We don't live in a dualistic universe with a good God and an evil God, and the devil and God are always fighting and nobody ever wins, right? We live in a singular universe created by one almighty God, and He permits the devil to tempt and test us. Never forget that. Don't lose heart. Don't lose hope. Our hope is the solid rock that's an all-powerful and all-knowing and all-righteous God that created everything. And He will provide for us if we will just trust Him. And finally, notice the last verse of the chapter. When people trust God, their example results in conversions. As a result of the faith displayed by the Jews and the providence of God working in the empire, a great many people converted to Judaism. In the same way today, when we're faithful to Jesus and outspoken about His message and His offer of forgiveness, awakenings occur. We need only to follow Jesus well and let that example be shown to others. If the light dwells within you, it cannot be hidden. It will by its very nature expose darkness and convict hearts of their need for Him. People will wonder why you are so different from everyone else. And the answer is Jesus. That's what makes us different. He's what makes us a peculiar people, chosen and set apart for good works that he prepared for us before the foundation of the world. Tell people about Jesus and live as an example for others of what Jesus looks like. And if we're faithful to that, the spiritual awakening that this country needs will happen. That's all I got, y'all. Questions? Comments? Rebukes? All right, let's pray and we'll... Go ahead.
Just a quick thing. I mentioned during the prayer thing that my granddaughter's father-in-law that diagnosed him Monday with cancer and all. She just sent me a text and